If a loved one dies, it's natural to want to hang on to something to remind you of them. Maybe a ring, maybe a favorite book or picture. That's the same idea in a very basic way behind the relics of the saints, held in high esteem by many faith traditions. And in Pittsburgh, oddly enough, there is said to be the largest Catholic collection of relics outside Rome.
God had a plan for these relics. Father Mullinger was his instrument in providing this place where the bodies of the saints are able to rest in peace.
A visit to St. Anthony's Chapel in this episode of Faithful. Welcome to another episode of the Faithful Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Ganser, and thanks very much for being here. Just a reminder, if you feel so inclined, on iTunes or wherever, please leave a review and share the word about the podcast. I'd be thankful, and I'd love to have as many of these thoughtful stories reach as many people as would appreciate them, really. That opening thought about wanting to hang on to something of a loved one after they die, that comes from St. Augustine in his work, The City of God, where he was talking about relics, funny enough. And later on, we'll have a full definition of what can be a relic and the types of relics. But for now, we're talking about a piece of a body, a drop of blood, a piece of bone, or something associated with a holy figure. Now, this can seem morbid, maybe, or confusing, or unsettling. St. Augustine wrote that if we valued a ring or clothing of a deceased loved one, quote, how much more reason ought we to care for the bodies of those we love, which they wore far more closely and intimately than any clothing. He goes on to call the body part of man's very nature. And St. Thomas Aquinas riffed on that. He wrote, we should, quote, honor any relics of saints in a fitting manner, their bodies, which were temples and organs of the Holy Ghost dwelling and operating in them, and are destined to be likened to the body of Christ by the glory of the resurrection, end quote. So in the Catholic tradition, it's not about worshiping relics, nor do Catholics worship saints, but honoring the relics is a reminder that these holy people existed, and the Church is pretty sure they made it to heaven. This is just a quick background, which will help us as we head now to Pittsburgh, where thousands of relics are housed in a hilltop chapel.
Welcome to St. Anthony's Chapel. During your visit here, we ask you to be aware that the chapel is an active worship site.
When you walk into this chapel atop Troy Hill in Pittsburgh, it may take time to get your bearings. The walls are lined, as you first walk in, by alcoves with life-sized and realistic stations of the cross. These are the 14 occurrences on the day of Jesus' crucifixion. These are carved from wood. They're exquisite. The altar is straight ahead from the entrance, past rows of old, dark wooden pews. And on the wall behind the altar and the walls leading up to it, it looks to be a bunch of shadow boxes, maybe, glass display cases filled with golden badges or what look to be chests or boxes or candlestick holders, maybe. These contain relics. They're reliquaries. There's purported to be a tooth from St. Anthony here, a thorn from the crown of thorns Jesus wore when he was tortured and crucified, a thread from the veil of Jesus' mother, Mary, and each item has documentation showing its provenance. Deacon Greg Jelinek showed me behind the altar where a chest is said to contain a number of bones from St. Demetrius, a martyr saint.
His effigy is portrayed on the top of the casket with his sword. He was a soldier. And then various bones of his are wrapped in silk and mounted on a velvet panel behind the glass. The certificate of authenticity for this reliquary even records the streets that this piece was carried on its way here to Troy Hill to find its resting place here.
Wow.
Please walk to the center of the chapel facing the high altar
That the remains of St. Demetrius and so many others ended up in this chapel is because of a priest named Sweetbert Godfrey Mullinger from the Kingdom of Belgium. He had studied medicine and came from a wealthy family. He met an American bishop looking for missionary volunteers, and in 1854 he came to America ready for seminary. He spent a little time in Ohio and worked in southwestern Pennsylvania and ended up in Pittsburgh in the year 1868. And Deacon Greg picks it up from there.
He had a dream to bring together these remains of the saints in one place so that they could be venerated by the faithful, and so that St. Anthony's Chapel could be erected as a sign of faith amidst the immigrant peoples of Troy Hill. Originally, he wanted to make the parish church into a church of relics, but the pastoral council, the elders at that time, were not in a position to provide the financial backing. So Father Mullinger said, that's okay, I'll do it with my own money. And he built it as pretty much his private chapel attached to the house where he resided here. The inscription above the archway in the chapel says in Latin, Corpora sanctorum in pace sepultus sunt, the bodies of the saints are buried here in peace. And that seems to be Mullinger's goal and plan, and it was brought to fruition before his death.
How can a priest finance something like this on his own? Can you talk about his background?
I can't imagine anybody doing it today because the expense would be astronomical, but he did come from a wealthy background. His father was involved in some sort of political position in Belgium, I guess it was. So he brought his family money and probably put about $300,000 into the project at that time, which would, again, be a huge amount of money today.
How does somebody collect relics? Because even saying that aloud, it seems inappropriate, difficult at best. How do you even begin to seek out the remains of the saints?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm glad to see that the cult of relics has kind of come full circle now in the beginning of the 21st century. I remember as a boy growing up, the whole scenario was kind of poo-pooed and kind of put on the back burner. The chapel was left to fall into a state of disrepair, and even though the parishioners loved their chapel, I don't think we appreciated or realized what we had here. So Father Mullinger, in his love for the saints, had spotters in Europe that would look for relics and collect them. Many of the places in Europe were turning to Protestantism and they didn't have the desire to maintain the relics. In Germany, parts of Italy were undergoing cultural revolution, and so the field was pretty hot for picking up relics. Mullinger was fastidious about obtaining certificates of authenticity for all the relics so that to the best of his and his spotter's knowledge, the relics would be authentic and have provenance indicating where they had come from originally. So.
And when you talk about relics in this chapel, you mean all the degrees of relics, right?
Yes. So there are three degrees of relic. A first-class relic is a relic that's actually from the body of a particular saint. Second-class relics are from the personal attributes of that saint, something that he or she touched or used during his or her life. And then third-class relics, of which we have very few, are sort of the everyman's relic. It's something that's touched to an authentic relic and then becomes, by extension, a third-class relic and something that the faithful can use as a private object for devotion.
Walking through the chapel, there is just so much. There are so many relics in this chapel. And I know I've had conversations with some Catholics, even non-Catholics, who don't understand relics. They don't understand why such respect is shown to remains. And I wonder if you would talk to that perception issue maybe about relics when something like this exists as such a remembrance to the lives of the saints and the Holy Family. But some people just can't wrap their minds around why the Catholic Church would do this or allow this.
Well, I'm not a theologian, but I can give you the simple explanation. I think of it as how my grandmother treasured things like a little snip of my hair from my childhood, or that first pair of baby shoes and things like this that were bronzed. I think that as human beings, we have a desire for the tangible, something that can be felt and held and treasured. And I think it's no different for us as Catholics. We are holy. We are the image and likeness of God, all of us as human beings. And the saints who best epitomize that call to holiness that God has planted in each of our hearts, that holiness in their physical body as well as in their soul, spirit, mind, doesn't disappear at the time of death. So these relics, their earthly remains, whether they be bone or blood or some other part of their body, retain that holiness that was their gift in this life. And so we venerate their remains, and for various reasons. One is that we can model our lives after the lives of these saints that stand as courageous and tremendous witnesses for us in our call to grow in holiness and to develop that relationship with God this side of heaven.
And we should make clear that in venerating the relics, this isn't worshiping them, this isn't praying to them in some way.
That's correct. Yeah, that's a common misconception. Some of our fellow Christians imagine that we Catholics worship saints or we worship Mary, and nothing could be further from the truth. From the earliest days of the Church, we've been careful to distinguish between veneration or honor, which we call doulia in Greek, or the other term for worship, latria, which is due only to God. We only worship God, but we respect and love the saints in the ways that they reflected the presence of God in this world.
So the chapel is independent. It's an independent entity, correct?
It isn't really. It's part of the Diocese of Pittsburgh. Some people would like to think of it in that way. It's been under the direction of Most Holy Name Parish since Father Mullinger's time. The diocese went through a legal battle at the time of Father Mullinger's death when his heirs laid claim to the chapel as his private property and possession. And so after several years' legal battle, the diocese was able to purchase at a nominal fee the chapel, and it's deeded to the Diocese of Pittsburgh as part of the parish under which it exists, which is Most Holy Name of Jesus Parish.
And how does it function within parish life? I know there are prayer services and obviously a number of altars there. Can you talk about how it fits into the parish community and services?
So the parish has long seen St. Anthony's Chapel as one of her greatest treasures, but its scope reaches far beyond this parish. We conduct a weekly novena service here on Tuesday mornings and Tuesday evenings, and we average about 50 people, but they come from all over the Pittsburgh area, and sometimes from much further as well. Pilgrims continue to flock to this chapel as they did in Father Mullinger's time. We're open for visits, for prayer, quiet reflection, also tours most days of the week, and we have morning mass here each morning at 8:30, and we continue to draw a significant contingent of those who choose to worship here.
One of the wonderful stories that plays in the tour even is about pilgrims who came and were healed and they left their canes. Can you tell that story and also tell us what happened to the canes at the end?
Well, let me tell you, as a young man, this place was kind of scary to me as a child because you came in and it was so dark and gloomy, and it wore the dirt of several decades from Pittsburgh, which was the smoky city back in those days. But piled in the corner near St. Anthony's altar were all these macabre crutches and braces and trusses and eyeglasses, dusty, and some very crude and simply made, others a little more refined. And there had to be 100 of them when I was a boy. And the reason is that Father Mullinger, who built the chapel, had a reputation as a healer in his own time. He had apparently studied medicine in Europe, in some of the European cities. When he realized that that was not God's plan for him, he realized that God wanted him to serve him as a priest. But he still brought that medical expertise and wisdom with him when he came here to Troy Hill. So many of the people who came here seeking the intercession of the saints at the chapel met with Father Mullinger, and he was very careful to speak with them individually. And he did several things. He prayed with them. He gave them various penances they might perform, something beyond the usual extent of their faith. And thirdly, it seems he dispensed prescriptions. I don't think there are too many priests today who write their own prescriptions, but Father Mullinger did. And he had a small apothecary behind the rectory here, where his assistant mixed up various elixirs and pills and things. And so many people came here, and they were cured either by the power of prayer, the intercession of the saints, the blessings that were given through Father Mullinger, but also possibly through the medical remedies, or maybe even pseudo-remedies that were dispensed at his hand. So the story is that the streetcar that ran to Troy Hill was actually was nicknamed the ambulance, because so many of the people on it were infirm in some way. But whether they suffered physically, mentally, spiritually, many, many people came here and found relief. And this tradition of healing and miracles continues even into our own century.
You talk about your experience as a boy. How far away did you grow up from the chapel?
Well, I said earlier that I grew up in the shadow of the chapel. That's perhaps a bit of a stretch. I grew up about a block from here in my grandmother's house just down the street. And we would come to the chapel, and as a boy I would crawl up into the stations and explore the place. And then as I got a little older, I became a little bit apprehensive about what might be in here. And finally, then I became an altar server, and so I was happy to serve at the altar at the novena when our pastor, Father Feldmar, conducted it when I was a boy. And then it was a great blessing then to be assigned here after my ordination, to be actually able to conduct that prayer and benediction that I had grown up with. It's a good place to be, and I feel like I've come full circle to it, like I've returned home here to St. Anthony's Chapel.
Can you talk more about the apprehension and how you got through that, where it came from, and what kind of remedied that for you?
Well, it was just a creepy place. It was dark. It was poorly lit. It had that aroma of candles and incense, and it just said mystery all over. And then you would peer into some of these cases, and you would see someone peering back at you in the form of one of the skulls, which are some of our larger relics here. And I think it had something of a haunted house kind of an effect on me as a child. And then as I grew in my own faith and matured and realized that these are not anyone who would harm us, but those who are our best advocates, who can, as we believe in our Catholic tradition, can intercede on our behalf before the throne of Almighty God, that these are friends. So to be here is to be surrounded by many, many friends and examples and models in my own call to personal holiness.
How are you impacted now to work here, but also just be here as a person surrounded by the friends, as you say? Can you talk about that ongoing influence maybe on your faith journey?
Well, the friends here are not only the saints whose remains are here, but also the church militant, the church here on earth, not just the church in heaven. And coming here, I've been exposed to a wealth of people of tremendous, deep, abiding faith who turn to God. Often they come here in their time of need and their times of stress and disappointment and even despair sometimes. And they find God's healing here. Occasionally physical healing, but most often healing of the spirit, healing of the psyche, the mind. And they leave this place refreshed through the power of the saints whose holiness just pervades this place.
I don't want to press too far, but has that happened for you too? Have you found personal solace or some sort of healing in being here?
Always, always. And again, not to get too personal, but when I've been involved with the sickness of a loved one or something like that, to be able to be in this place and to know that the person I love, even if they pass from this life to the next, they're going to pass into the open arms of God, as all these blesseds and saints have done in years past. One of my favorite things now is to stay, when I lock up the chapel after the service on Tuesday evenings, is to stay and pray night prayer here with all the saints. And it is a tremendous, it's a great inspiration. It's almost tangible that you can feel the presence, just like when you're with any of your friends, that you know that they are very much with you and very much a part of you.
You said before that you thought we had come full circle in the church in understanding and venerating relics. The church population at large is challenged now, and a lot of people have turned from the church. Some are coming back. But do you think that there needs to be more education even about what something like St. Anthony's Chapel is, or that it exists, or what its purpose is for?
Sure, I think that's a great call, and that's something that I hope will grow over the next years. We've been appointed a new director at St. Anthony's Chapel, Father Jim Orr, and I know he has great and wonderful plans to spread the news of this place. We have to do what Jesus said to his apostles when they had questions. He said, come and see, come and see. So come and see St. Anthony's Chapel, see what it's all about, and find that peace, that inspiration, that solace that you can find here.
Do you think there are other things people maybe misunderstand or should know that they don't even think about a place like St. Anthony's? Misconceptions or not even conceptions at all that they don't think about?
Well, I know I had misconceptions when I was assigned St. Anthony's Chapel, because I thought, the first thing the pastor told me here at Most Holy Name, Father Dave Shore of blessed memory, he said, well, you're going to be taking the Tuesday evening novena every Tuesday. And I thought, that's not really my speed, That was in the past, and that's not where the church is going today.
To do a novena.
To pray novenas and to just kneel before the Blessed Sacrament, it just seems so old-fashioned. And, we should be out there feeding the poor and clothing the naked and so on, which we certainly need to do. And all these saints are great reminders that our call is to do that. But we also have to do as Jesus and his apostles did. We have to just step away from the busyness of this world and place ourselves before the Lord. And to be able to do that in the company of so many holy people, it really has been just so transformative for me.
If you could address one of my personal hang-ups, every time I think of St. Anthony's, since I found out about it years ago, and I visited here a number of times, I've thought to myself, first of all, how does a place like this exist? I didn't know that such a reliquary would exist with so many venerated relics, but also that it's in Pittsburgh, that I don't know where I would expect it to be, but to be in Troy Hill and the history of this place in Pittsburgh, somehow it seems like a disconnect and somehow it doesn't. I wonder if you would talk to that maybe misconception that I had.
It does seem like an unlikely place to find a collection like this. Many people say this is the largest collection of relics outside of Rome. I don't know if that's ever been substantiated. But what I think is this: there are so many unusual or surprising things that had to take place for this chapel to exist today. The right time and place and the right person in Father Mullinger, and a community that was receptive to the idea of St. Anthony's Chapel and the money to do it and so on. But to boil it down into two words, I would say this: God's will. God had a plan for these relics. Father Mullinger was his instrument in providing this place where the bodies of the saints are able to rest in peace, and we can continue to venerate them and grow in the example and love for God and his saints well into the 21st century, and hopefully for many, many years to come.
So you definitely think that this is very much a relevant place and an important place in today's world, but also in the present church.
To me, it's most relevant. And I think not only in the present church, but in the present world, we have a strong need for good, healthy models. If you look to the world of sports or the world of politics, so often our expectations are raised and eventually dashed by those who fail to live up to our expectations. The saints will never disappoint. Again, there are examples. There's a saint for every person, for every walk of life, and to study their lives and to see what they were able to do against sometimes seemingly insurmountable odds, how they were able to seek and to follow the plan that God laid out for them, and to find happiness and fulfillment in this world and perfect happiness in the next. These are the stories that we need to teach our children. These are the things that can guide us and help us through a world that's often portrayed as pointless or irrelevant or just going nowhere. We know we're going somewhere.
And just finally, is there anything else you'd like to say, either about how this place has affected you or maybe about the place itself?
Well, simply that this place has made my faith stronger. I think I'm a better Catholic and a more sympathetic listener, and I do a better job in my active ministry as a teacher at our local high school here in the Diocese of Pittsburgh, in my ministry to the sick and the needy in our own parishes. This place has helped me to do that perhaps a little more effectively and a little more sincerely.
Through the examples of the saints?
Through the examples of the saints, as well as the support and strength of the people that form the worshiping community here at St. Anthony's Chapel.
Deacon Greg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tony. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed learning about this remarkable chapel in Pittsburgh. And if you're ever in the neighborhood, I hope you do stop by and see it yourself. It's something to behold. Thank you for listening, and please share episodes if you like them. And if you have ideas for stories, please get in touch. Maybe we can feature it in a future episode. And also, please have a great day.